we're going to have a reduced supply of those raw materials. Meanwhile, the demand will be increasing. And I don't see it's immovable force versus unstoppable object. It's just, it doesn't look like it's going to turn out well.
Welcome back to Rockstock Channel, and thanks for checking in. Before we launch into the interview, we'd like to thank all our Patreon sponsors. And for those of you who are new, share a bit about us. RK Equity is an advisory firm run by Rodney, Hooper, and me, Howard Klein. We are exclusively focused on raising awareness about companies producing or developing the next generation critical raw materials that are powering Tesla's EV battery energy transition. Please register your email at rkequity.com and follow Rodney and me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Please also subscribe to this channel, Rockstock Channel on YouTube, as well as Lithium-ion Rocks on SoundCloud for our podcasts. Please note, Rodney and me are not financial advisors or broker-dealers. Nothing you hear in this video is investment advice. Please do your own research and read the disclaimer at the end of this video or on our website. Thanks again for the support, and let's get into the video.
Good morning and good afternoon to Jordan. Welcome onto the Rockstock channel. For those that know Jordan, he has a fantastic channel, The Limiting Factor, that delves deeply into all things EV and particularly around the Tesla side. Jordan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rodney.
We've had a lot of activity in the last while from various fronts. And the one thing that I did see you post on, and that's sort of been intriguing me a little bit, was VW Power Day. Some things that were put up on screen with lots of green lighting in the background, but I had a couple of things were flagged for me. Just broadly, your general thoughts on Power Day?
I would have to say that I'd go with what Rob Maurer said on Tesla Daily, which is it was kind of a battery day light. It wasn't as technically deep, and it just wasn't quite as convincing as Battery Day. It was more convincing than, for instance, GM's Battery Day or whatever they called it. But Power Day, it seemed further off into the future and a little bit more nebulous. I'm glad they're heading that direction. But I think the primary reason why they're doing this is because of market pressures rather than because they want to actually do this.
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting one. It's fantastic to see a tier one auto company making the sort of level of commitment that VW is. I did feel they're sort of conveniently picking some of the stuff that's sort of out there or on platforms to sort of say that's the future, and then obviously give a big punt to solid state, which is what they have invested in. But yeah, I mean, and just on that front, my thoughts, and I'm interested, you can shoot them down, is I feel like the increasing amount of silicon being doped into the anode is going to bring great things to lithium-ion battery, to energy density. Personally, I think Tesla is probably 2 years away from sort of 350, 400 watt hours a kilo from increasing the silicon doping into the anode and obviously improving charging. So my thoughts are, if anything, silicon doping is actually going to increase the market for graphite in general, expand it, because it's going to produce a very good quality cell, in 2 years' time, and possibly beat solid state to the punch. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think that solid state, their current targets are good, but they're working with a moving target when it comes to graphite and silicon anodes. I think the numbers that solid state is touting, I think we're going to see that from graphite silicon anodes sooner or about the same time, but it will also be much cheaper. I'm not convinced that these solid state batteries that are being touted at the moment are going to be extremely low cost, which is what we're going to need in the late 2020s. I do think at some point solid state will catch up, but it's still an early stage technology. And I think in the late 2020s, it will still be in the early stages of scaling, and we won't see it at large scale, very large scale, until the probably the early 2030s. And it might have a completely different use case than regular lithium-ion batteries that are high nickel, just like there's high nickel batteries and lithium iron phosphate, solid state might have a specific use case that it's best for.
I'm with you on this. I think the other thing is, there's one thing proving the technology, there's another thing scaling it to commercial production and producing it in large scale for less than $100 per kilowatt hour. You're thinking around that. I mean, one thing to say it can be done, and as you and I know, there's solid state, and then there's solid state, and then there's solid state. There's a lot of permutations of solid state. As you say, you want to cheap, how realistically are we going to get commercial mass production of what we're talking about, genuine, full-blown solid state to under $100 per kilowatt hour?
I think they'll hit it later in the 2020s. I mean, if QuantumScape's collateral is correct, because what QuantumScape, if you crunch the numbers on their documentation that they put out, it looks like they're shooting for $50 to $60 per kilowatt hour at the cell level in the late 2020s, which I expect Tesla to hit probably around $50 per kilowatt hour about 2025. And that, I'm thinking they might be able to do that at the pack level in 2025. That might be a bit of a stretch, but I think that's what they're striving
that's
for.
Aggressive.
That's
aggressive.
It is. But it would take some time to get in those numbers and how I figured that. And I do think that's aggressive.
And I think you've just touched on a good point. So if we think, Jordan, if we're going to go to silicon doped anodes with improved energy density and faster charging, what is the outstanding use case then by the time that solid state gets to this point? Because if you're getting phenomenal, if you're getting sub 15-minute charging to 80%, and you're going to get range to, I don't know, 800 kilometers, or what you would call 500 miles, and you can do that at that price, just talk me through, what do I need solid state for?
The key thing that I can think of would be safety, but even that might slip away with some of the technologies that I see on the horizon. Like there's current collectors that a company called Soteria is developing, and they actually help make a battery non-flammable. So I would think solid state's key benefit is safety, but I see ways in which conventional lithium ion can be made much more safe. Now, at the very limit, I see solid state batteries, true solid state batteries, as a better first principles solution. It's one less thing that you have to mess around with in the battery. You don't have to inject the battery with electrolyte. You can put the solid state material on a roll-to-roll platform if you get it right. But I haven't seen anything convincing in that department yet, where you can just roll your cathode and anode with a solid state separator in between, done. You don't have to mess around with injecting electrolyte. That's something I still need to look into further.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's the sort of question that comes up now. If we touch back to VW, as I said, I thought there were some sort of pieces of the puzzle, and that they were just kind of conveniently picking. But the one thing that I flagged up that just did not make sense to me, other than the fact that China is a central part of VW's future story, was the mentioning of synthetic graphite.
It seemed out of place given Volkswagen's strategy and their market. Because my understanding, synthetic graphite is much, much more CO2 intensive than natural graphite. And you can find natural graphites that are, well, natural graphite is much cheaper than synthetic graphite and much lower CO2 emissions. So if Volkswagen wants to be competitive on cost, I would assume they would need more natural graphite. And given that the market they're operating in, they'd want something low CO2, because my understanding is that higher CO2 products in the EU will have some sort of tax put on them to make them more expensive. And you can probably help fill me in there.
So yeah, exactly. So there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But now I understand that, I still don't get the logic. So if you say, well, great, this isn't coming into the EU, it's going to be produced in China and used in China vehicles. But if you export those vehicles or do anything, in the end, are we not moving to a world that's $100 a ton carbon tax for everyone? That's just the way it feels to me. I think the US is going to move that way. Europe is going to get close. Canada's already had it reestablished. They had a court hearing on it. So exactly what you're saying. So on a cost basis, natural is cheaper. You've got companies like Nouveau Monde, and I think Talga will be the same, that are shooting for, they're going to be carbon neutral. You're going to get a certificate that says there's zero carbon on this. And no matter what you do in the processing piece of synthetic graphite, you still start with needle coke. You're still starting with a petroleum, whatever you want to call it, waste or byproduct. So there's no way around that. So I still, it's for Europe, definitely, if you look at companies and OEMs looking to become carbon neutral, why would you go for something that's roughly 5 tons of CO2 per ton of product? And I'm not even sure you're including the needle coke CO2 in that, or the transport once you've produced it in China and shipped it, into your product. So is there a performance angle where synthetic is better than natural, that you would say that's why I want to use it?
Well, that's where I was going to go to next. If you're putting silicon, higher levels of silicon in with the graphite, I would think that would higher levels of silicon will increase the charging speed of the anode. And I think part of the reason why synthetic anode was used in the past was part of it was I think it has better power characteristics. You can get ions into it and out of it more quickly. So that's part of the reason why it was used in the past. And it also tends to have better cycle life. But you can solve the charge speed issue with silicon, and I think you can solve the cycle life issue with a good quality natural graphite and the right electrolyte mix, based on the research I've done. So there doesn't seem any good.
The industry agrees with you. I mean, if you look at Benchmark and everyone else, they're going from a sort of evenish split now to 2/3, 1/3 natural graphite in 10 years. So they're saying that's the shift, and the industry guys are agreeing with you, is that the quality of what you can produce with natural graphite now is very good. So now I don't understand, other than if you're in China and it's right there, but then there's still the cost issue, and you don't get around the CO2 issue.
Yeah, to me, it seemed like they were trying to throw in. It felt like the presentation, and this is no disrespect to the people who are working at VW and their battery laboratories that are doing good hard work and doing good science on batteries. But what happens at the boardroom level is often very different. And you also often get presentations like this that are done by committee, and they feel pieced together, and it feels like they tried to throw in buzzwords, or people wanted to ring their own bell, something they're working on within the company. And that's what it felt like with the dry battery electrode, with QuantumScape, and with the synthetic anode. It felt like it was just something they were throwing into the presentation to maybe get interest or maintain relevancy. I'm not sure. It didn't seem to fit.
The only one other thing, Jordan, that kind of does it is, if you look at the pinch points, and hence the name of your channel, the limiting factor, which is it going to be? Now, we started off and spent a lot of time, because lithium is the irreplaceable element in the battery. But the more we've had a look and the more we've listened across the industry, you're seeing more and more possible pinch points across what can happen. Now, you mentioned as well in your podcast, and I suggest people listen in, about LFP. Now, LFP still needs graphite. It still needs silicon. One way or the other, you're going to use it in the anode, or you're not. So the only thing I'm thinking of is, was VW looking for an absolutely robust way that if people try to poke holes, they're saying, well, where are the pinch points? So needle coke, I guess you can access. If you look at Benchmark's forecasts, I think out of a couple of company presentations that I've seen, it looks like there's a shortfall of graphite by 2023. So are you saying the surest route to saying I've got a robust supply chain, even if it's dirty, even if it's more expensive, even if it's this, people can access needle coke and I can get supply no matter what?
it didn't seem like the rest of the presentation had that much thought put into it, to be able to assume that they were trying to signal to somebody that their supply chain is secure. I don't know what the best way to put that. It's
to me, they were sort of picking things that seemed very like realistic and here and now, and then obviously the solid state later to say our supply chain. They didn't explain how, and they don't explain the routes, and it's amazing how people gloss over not just them. I saw, BMW in their announcement with lithium with Livent. They said, oh, we get our other lithium from Australia, which they don't. They get it from Ganfeng in China, and Ganfeng uses Australian spodumene. So a bit of greenwashing going on a little bit all over, but I guess we'll have to see how this all plays out. But the only other, I'm trying to think of ways that one could justify why you would go that route, other than saying, it's accessible as long as you supply the needle coke, BTR, whoever can produce synthetic graphite for me, no matter what.
Well, my understanding is that Tesla currently uses a mix of synthetic and natural graphite. I don't know what Tesla's trend is, but it seems like the trend of the rest of the industry is to move more towards natural anode based on the same sources that you quoted. So even if they put synthetic in their presentation, I don't think they would be using pure synthetic. It would almost certainly be using a mix of natural and synthetic anode, and it wouldn't just be pure synthetic. So I don't know why they focused on just synthetic.
Yeah, I think so. So if we look at Tesla's battery day, and they sort of saying localized supply chains, that's what they were flagging up, because I've done it in a video before with Ivan. If you bought a Tesla in Europe, your lithium had traveled 40,000 kilometers to get to you by the time it had finally been done, all the pieces of it. So they have now shifted towards localized supply chain, and you've got people like Nouveau Monde for them in North America, and then Tolga and whoever in Europe. So the thing is, if you have localized supply chain with zero carbon, same price, my mind is, I know where this is going. If you can get if you can get the same thing for the same price with zero carbon in $100 a ton carbon tax world, if you think about it, it's one of the things that logically, to me, graphite is cheaper than, say, lithium per ton, but it's still, there's a lot of it in the battery and it weighs a lot. So transporting it is carbon intensive on a value basis, and then producing it also on a value basis, there's a lot of carbon in it. So it's one of the parts of the battery that most logically you would look to reduce CO2.
Yeah, I can't think of a way to steel man the argument for synthetic anode. And I thought that about that presentation for a while. I thought about a lot of the same things that you're thinking of, and you've mentioned, you provided a bit more detail that I didn't have. And yeah, it seems the argument gets stronger against synthetic the more that you think about it.
I mean, I think it has, of course, it has a place, and if you can improve the processing, and I know Novonix is looking at it in the US and so on. So I'm sure there are ways to do it, but as long as they are sustainable and as long as you can use cleaner energy in it, I guess if it's unavoidable, but if you can go an opposite route of full electric fleet, mining and natural graphite and so on, and come out at zero, that's the ideal situation. But I know we live in a practical world, but we'll see. The other thing, I don't know, Jordan, if you've ever looked into, like China has to some extent been clamping a bit more down on sustainability and on some of the mining and processing practices. I guess, could that be, a risk going forward for synthetic out of China?
That's not something I've looked into. I'd like to do a video series on China because it's a blank spot for me, and that's where a lot of the market is currently. The only synthetic producer I'm aware of outside of China is Novonix. Are there any other synthetic producers that you know of? And Novonix isn't even really a producer yet. They intend to produce, and they're working on getting a foothold in the market.
Yes, and they're the only synthetic ex-China on our scoreboard, on Howard's, on Howard's graphite scoreboard. The rest are all natural producers. And again, I'm saying I don't want to be unfair on them, because if they go for specific processes and procedures, they could probably lower the carbon footprint and I don't know, to zero. So I'm saying I'm not closed to synthetic. I'm just saying right now, if your route is China and synthetic, we know what the numbers are, and the numbers don't make sense in terms of carbon footprint and what you use as a feedstock.
Yeah, Novonix is. I looked at them into them quite a bit, and in terms of synthetic, not only are they the only producer outside of China, they're minimal amounts of CO2 for a synthetic graphite. The only concern, and maybe you can enlighten me on this, because this is something I've been hunting around for, is what does the raw materials market look like for that as you get deeper into the 2020s? Because my understanding is they'd be competing with other industries for that needle coke and for that material. And I'm wondering if there would be a supply bottleneck somewhere as they try to ramp.
No, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, and that's why I think Benchmark and others are also saying there's a natural gravitation aside from cost and CO2. There's natural feedstock supply, as you say, because you do compete. And if we've already had peak oil, where does one go from here? I mean, it's an interesting one. So if you look at the number of countries and cities, as people become more comfortable with the charging infrastructure and saying we think that there's enough infrastructure to back it, and even the European OEMs of saying, if you back us with infrastructure, we will shift to EVs. Because there's a case to say that, even with what VW is saying, 70%, EVs in Europe by 2030 and 50 in the US, as long as you're comfortable with the charging infrastructure and the sort of clean power to back that charging infrastructure, from a commercial perspective, we know probably latest 2025, EVs are cheaper than internal combustion engines. Are we moving to an almost all EV world by 2030? In which case, and then if you do have solid state, or if you do have improved silicon doped anodes, etc., what about aviation and using lithium-ion or solid state batteries? The case for oil and transport starts to fall away pretty quickly.
Yeah, we're going to have a reduced supply of those raw materials. Meanwhile, the demand will be increasing, and I don't see it's immovable force versus unstoppable object. It's just, it doesn't look like it's going to turn out well. I don't know what other raw materials they could use to produce synthetic graphite. I think there's one company here in New Zealand that's actually working on producing graphite from like wood material, but that's early stages, and I'm not convinced of, I think it's called Carbonscape maybe, but I don't know whether that's going to be viable or not. So I don't.
It will be interesting. It will be interesting to see. But yeah, I mean, that was an interesting angle that they raised. Just on the bidirectional, charging and discharging and so on VW. Your thoughts on that? I mean, Elon sort of dismissed it a little bit. I've always thought it's quite a good idea.
Yeah. Now, I think it's a good idea for Europe. I think they've been working towards that, and they have the regulatory bodies and the regulations in place and a roadmap in place, where I think the US is a bit more patchwork and not as well prepared for something like that. So I think we'll see it in Europe. I don't know when we'll see it in the US. To the extent that I want to see it, which is you're able to not only use your vehicle to power your house, but also participate in the energy market.